Thank you everyone for joining today this afternoon, no matter where you are. It might be morning in some places. So today's topic is part of our continuing series of webinars on how to practically improve public procurement. Today's topic, as you may have attended before on multiple occasions, an important one on workforce development. And we'll talk a bit about our work there, but today I'm excited that at the end of the day, practicality is what we really aim for. So we have some case studies, and we're gonna just get into the weeds a bit about how do you actually take things like competency models and other things and put them in action. So very excited to hear from our speakers, who I'll introduce in a second. So the agenda is really short here in the short 55 minutes to an hour we have. First we'll just go over the workforce competency model that Public Spend Forum spent multiple years on with really the community. And just give you a brief introduction on that, and some of you may have seen it before. And then really jump into two case studies, one from Fairfax County, Virginia, and one from Rockland County, New York. And so we're eager to learn from those, and hopefully, you'll find value there, and you'll be able to reach back out to our speakers. And then we'll also then just have an open discussion. So if you have questions, as you know, you can submit questions at any point. We really want a conversation here as opposed to just kind of a monologue. And so please do submit your questions so we can all really learn from those as well. All right, so let me go ahead and first introduce our speakers today. We're gonna go through the case studies. And so we have first Patricia Innocenti, who's the Deputy Director at Fairfax County in Virginia, close by where I am. Welcome, Patricia.
Thanks, Raj. Patty Innocenti to everyone. As Raj mentioned, I'm Deputy Director at Procurement and Material Management. I think you've got an old snip there. I identify myself as the Chief Operating Officer for our organization, so work very closely with Kathy Muse as the Director, and our kind of running joke is I'm the one that makes the trains run on time. So I do a lot of work in the HR element of our organization, as well as legislative and policy aspects.
Great,
and,
great. Sorry,
back to you.
Great, thank you, Patty, and really excited. And I know Kathy, we've had a chance to engage on multiple occasions about all the things going on in procurement. So excited to hear. Fairfax County is, of course, one of the largest counties in the country. And then we also have Paul Brennan, who's the Director of Purchasing for Rockland County, and also President of ProcurePath, and doing some exciting work around really helping develop the workforce. Welcome, Paul.
Good afternoon, Raj. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. As you said, I'm the Director of Purchasing for Rockland County in New York, which is about 30 minutes out of New York City, so we're right in the metropolitan New York area.
Thanks, Patty and Paul. So we just need to get through a couple of slides here, and then we'll really want to get to the discussion. So as many of you may know, I'm Raj Sharma. I'm the CEO and founder of Public Spend Forum. I will leave it at that so we can get to really the content here. First, before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor, Ivalua. You may be familiar with Ivalua. It's an e-procurement platform, really working with corporations all over the world, but now also lots of government, including federal government of Canada, New York City, my home state of Maryland, Ohio. So I'd encourage you to check out really all the great things Ivalua is doing in helping enable the procurement process digitally. And sorry, it looks like I'm having a little bit of, it's like I might have clicked on a link here. So let me go back. There you go. Also, just want to tell you about GovShop. So if you're familiar with Public Spend Forum, we've introduced a product called GovShop, which is a supplier research platform for government agencies all over the world to be able to easily find and research suppliers, as well as contracts. So in local governments, that would be cooperative contracts. So please check that out at govshop.com. It's free. And hopefully tell us about how you like it, and you can find some good new suppliers there right away. Let me then just click on, and Public Spend Forum, I'm sure you know about. Public Spend Forum is a global community. You can check out a lot of the resources there that we're providing around market intelligence, as well as best practices all across the world. All right, with that, let me just go ahead and jump into our topic. So the public procurement workforce development, right? That's the topic today. So several years ago, we took on an important piece of work, first that was funded by the Volcker Alliance, which is out of New York. Paul Volcker, who's the Federal Reserve Chair formerly, his nonprofit funded some of the work. And then we were able to engage with the universities, NIGP, others, to really build on that work. And basically what we did was we took on the work of defining a workforce competency model. And I'll show you that in a second, but in a nutshell, what is a competency model? So competency model is basically what are the skill sets required of the profession, right? Across the board, and then being able to segment those and identify and match them up against roles. But what we wanted to do was come up with a simple model based on best practices, forward-looking view of where the profession is going, where industry is going. And so we it took multiple years because we really wanted this to be not just a academic exercise, but something that was also being used, really was in collaboration with, as it says right here, leaders, practitioners, academics, experts. So many people like Paul and Patty, others. So we engaged a lot of leaders out there and experts to get input. And then what we came out with was a competency model. I'll show you that in a second, that is now being used by multiple agencies, and I think Paul and Patty will mention how they've looked at it as well. But also, really, NIGP has been a great partner. They've also, used that as a base for starting and building on their new procurement pathways, training pathways. So this has really been a hallmark work for us, and we're really excited that others are starting to use it. And just a very quick preview of that before we jump into the case studies. So here's the competency model. You can check it out on our website. We'll put a link up here in a second. But essentially, the competency model is grouped into these 7 buckets you see here. We don't have time today to get into all the details, but we'll also post a link for a previous webinar where we actually did discuss all of this in detail. But essentially what we did is we grouped competencies into 7 large buckets that you see across the top: strategy, policy, and so forth. And then within those, within each larger bucket, we defined a sub bucket or sub categories. And so now this is being used to really align roles, align job descriptions, and training, et cetera. And that's kind of what we'll be discussing today, whether it's this model or other models that Patty and Paul may have. So I encourage you to check this out. Again, we don't have time today to get into the details, but hopefully, as we discuss through our case studies, you'll see some of this come to life as we move ahead. So with that, let me just go ahead, Patty, jump into the first case study. So just for the audience here, just to give you a sense, what we're gonna do is take about 10, 12 minutes each to talk about the case studies, Fairfax and Rockland County. And then we'll make that a discussion, and then we'll follow up with a lot more questions for the latter part of the hour here today. So Patty.
All right, thanks, Raj. So what you see on the slide is a little bit of demographic information about the county's procurement office. We have over $700 million in throughput for procurement spend annually. We maintain a portfolio of over 1,500 contracts. We are a full-service county government, so we buy everything under the sun. And while we have 73 positions in the procurement office, I have 19 that are in the contracts division. And what I want to talk about is the changes that we have successfully made in the past year to the career path and the classification structure for the contract specialist. And I want to talk about what motivated that, how we got there, and the successes that we've had through this process. So about a year ago, I really started taking a hard look at the kind of work that's being performed by the contract specialist and how it was misaligned with the way that our class specifications were written, and to take that a step further, the way that our compensation specialists were using that information to go out to market and identify benchmarks for compensation for our contract specialists. And as you know, compensation is one of the biggest factors in attracting talent, and we were failing there. So going back to looking at our model for the class specifications and the career series, it became very clear to me that that whole series was really built around the 1980s, when we did a lot of work for low bid, competitive sealed bidding. You issued an invitation for bid, it came back, you made an award. We were not dealing with vendor agreements. We weren't dealing with technology agreements. Weren't a lot of legal issues to be considered. And the staff skills really, all we required at the time were basic proficiency in procurement principles. It was not as technically complex as the way that we work right now. And one final factor is that staff was really aligned around commodities, and that's not what we buy anymore. We buy goods and we buy technology. So having reviewed where we were, I had a lot of benchmark metrics on the type of work that we're doing today. And that's what initiated the review of the career series. So in Fairfax County now, the work coming through our central procurement office is 70% negotiated agreements. So that's really a sea change from where we were 30 years ago. And you might wonder, well, what the heck are they doing in Fairfax County that so much of that work is negotiated? About 30% of it is RFPs, so requests for proposals, competitive sealed negotiations. But the other bulk of that negotiated work is sole sources, and it's technology agreements. So if we're buying software through a reseller, even though we have a contract with the reseller, we still have to negotiate the license agreements. And that's complex work, and that's very different from the work we did 30 years ago. And because of the complexity and the nature of the legal issues, we work much more closely with the Office of the County Attorney in reviewing those agreements, distilling what are legal matters versus business matters and negotiating, and that is, it requires a different skill set. So that was kind of the impetus for us to approach Central HR to begin the discussion about classification and compensation. So married with all of that is the fact that Fairfax County has in our employee evaluation process an element called a career management plan. So we were looking at marrying up a way to identify how staff can progress throughout their career series and advance themselves and prepare themselves for the next step in their career. So that was one element of it. Oh, and then I became aware of the information from the Volcker report, and it seemed to shine a light on the problem that we were trying to solve. The report was further refined with Public Spend Forum and the NIGP to develop this competency model. And what we were able to do is put together sort of a graph format or a spreadsheet format, the career series, what was required as basic skills, what was required for software skills, what was required for county training, required for professional training through NIGP, and then marry all that up with the competencies, because once I looked at it, it became clear to me it wasn't just about going through training, but what were you able to demonstrate in terms of your proficiency in each of the job classifications. And that was particularly useful for new employees because, you know, at the end of the first year, they become merit employees. So if you're not able to demonstrate to me within that first year that you are proficient in the basic skills for that position, then, you know, maybe I, as a supervisor, have made a mistake. But using that and marrying it up with the training made sure that I lived up to my obligation to train any new employee so they were prepared to become proficient at the end of the first year. So having said all that, what was missing from our career series was really something in between someone who's achieved a highly skilled level of contract work and the supervisor. And using the competency model, we went back to central HR and were able to make the argument that we needed another step in the career series, which we have defined as the Contract Specialist 3, which you see on that slide. And what is a Contract Specialist 3 is someone who has demonstrated advanced contracting skills, but they also have a proficiency in a certain area. So when I look at the competency model, I think it aligns very nicely with the Group 4 skills. So you'll see in Group 4's negotiation, sourcing methods. I think there's another one where there's a block in there about expertise in specific markets. And where we align the Contract Specialist 3s was in information technology procurements, professional like A&E contracts, and then construction contracting. So those were the competencies and the specialized skill sets that we were able to define and align with that Contract Specialist 3. It's a non-supervisory position, but once we inserted that into the career series, it also advanced the argument to raise the grade for our Contract Specialist supervisors by 2 levels. So you can see that once I need to go out and hire another Contract Specialist supervisor, the pay range is going to be higher. So I'm hoping that that also will help us attract better talent for our organization. And same when we start recruiting for the Contract Specialist 3s, although I think those will all be internal promotions. So there were a lot of benefits of bringing all this insight together, both from looking at the type of work we do and then marrying that up with the county's compensation philosophy and the very insightful work that the Volcker report and the Public Spend Forum brought to this. It just helped inform the decision and particularly the argument that I had been advancing with central HR. So I think that, you know, that really explains or covers what I wanted to share with our experience here in Fairfax County with how we were able to benefit from the work of the Public Spend Forum and the competency model.
Great.
Raj?
Yes, thank you, Patty. And That was great, and I took a bunch of notes here. I do have a few follow-ups, as I'm sure others do as well. Um, uh, so maybe what we'll do is we'll come back. But one question I do want to ask before we jump into the Rockland County case study is, you mentioned that some of the impetus behind starting this process of looking at your job descriptions, and one was around compensation. Also, you mentioned some things around types of contracts and things, so a different kind of set of skills required. So, just more specifically, was there any particular skill area that stood out that you were missing, that you felt like, obviously there might have been different multiple ones, but is there anything that really stuck out that you felt like needed to be addressed in the revisions, um, as one of the dimensions of improving your position descriptions, et cetera?
That's a really good question. What we had been struggling with were analytical skills,
Hmm.
and also being able to hire individuals who could do market research and translate that research into our solicitations. So we were writing better solicitations rather than just recycling something that had been done in the past. So that's an expectation that we have for staff, is to improve the scope of work, improve specifications, and also use market research tools to make sure that we have the best possible strategy when we go out to market.
Great, great. And I think if we had some of the slides from the data we got back, those are definitely two areas: more analytical skills and market research, that came up as having significant gaps, and they ranked fairly high in terms of the gaps that at least leaders identified. We'll jump into a larger conversation here in a minute, but I'd like to just bring Paul into the conversation here. Paul, I would love to hear about Rockland County and some of the work you're doing there in terms of workforce development.
Sure, thanks, Raj. Just to give a little background, as I said before, Rockland County is just outside of New York City. Our spend is about $130 million annually. We manage over 500 term contracts. We're a totally centralized purchasing function. I have 8 people reporting to me currently. We are currently in the process of adding 2 positions that we're actually interviewing for now. So the workforce competency model is right front and center of us as we interview for new positions. Earlier this year, I was fortunate to get support from my administration, and the county created a procurement center of excellence. And part of the goal of that is to increase the capacity of the smaller local governments and school districts within our jurisdiction. And one of the things that we found, since we've done about half a dozen or more training sessions so far this year, is that while organizations like myself, again, counties larger than me, look at this competency model and can very easily identify gaps, and I'll touch base on that in a minute, of where we are and where we need to be. But that gap is even larger in smaller procurement organizations. So, depending upon the size of the organization, the gap may be greater than some of the larger organizations that tend to have more staff and get more support. But we're using the competency model as we go down the road in terms of interviewing for positions. When the competency model first came out, I approached my personnel commissioner about rewriting all of our job specifications and job descriptions. Most government agencies, at least in my area, all have the same issue in terms of a lot of the job descriptions are outdated, don't really meet the current responsibilities of procurement. I think Patty did a very good job summarizing how procurement's responsibilities and the things that we carry out have changed so dramatically over the past number of years. And so my personnel commissioner was very interested in this because she identified this as a problem that she was trying to address countywide. And she thought it would be great that we actually had research to work with, as opposed to just trying to redo job descriptions ourselves, but we actually have a body of research to work with in getting these done. In New York, with the state civil service system, it's a little complicated and takes time to go through and get these job descriptions modified, and then the tests that match up with them also need to be modified. But we're in that process now and are committed to working through that so we can have a better testing process for our positions. One of the things that we realized once we were able to get some new positions and started the interview process, we kind of went back through what we did previously over the years and took out our files of interview questions, and started to realize that the old tried and true interview questions really don't match up well with the new competency model. Many of those interview questions were very process oriented and process related, and not necessarily really skill related that matched up with the current competency model. So we're in the interview process now, and that's something that we're doing, is making sure that we identify which of these competencies line up to each position. So that's one of the things you can do. Not all of these competencies align to every position within your organization, depending upon the function of that particular position. Certainly, some of the competencies are more management related, and some of them are more line related. But you really need to look at each position in your organization and map those competencies that you feel can be attributed to that particular position. And certain competencies will be mapped to multiple positions. So it's not just, you can just map one competency to one position within your organization. That competency may be mapped to multiple positions. So that's really how we started in terms of looking at what we need to look for when we start interviewing candidates. And in our situation, it's a little challenging because we're using a civil service system that's a test-based system, and the tests are really based upon outdated criteria. But we've determined that we can work in these competency models and these skills through the interview process to help us determine which are really the best candidates for the positions. The other area where we're yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Just one question I have related to. I think you made a really good point there about, I think it's tied to the third bullet point here of, not every competency may apply to every position, right?
Correct.
Can you give an example of that, like a difference between, say, a supervisory or a senior position versus, say, somebody who's kind of, doing procurements? What would be a position, like a competency difference that one position may require versus another?
Sure. Well, if you look under Group 2, policy, legislation, and program oversight, certain areas like legislation and legal environment are areas that may really be more competencies for management personnel within the division, as opposed to a entry-level buyer or even a senior buyer. Mm-hmm. While even other items in that group in terms of ethics and integrity and transparency really apply to everybody that's involved in the purchasing function. So you really need to look at each one. Enabling regulations and compliance. Well, certainly from a management standpoint, you're going to be more involved in shaping those regulations and ensuring compliance. Still, a buyer or a contract administrator is still going to have to understand those regulations and making sure they're complying with them also. So the competencies can apply differently depending upon the particular job title. And I think that's a good example of how they may apply or may not apply to a particular type of position.
Great, that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay. And then the final point on the slide here that I think is a very good part of the workforce competency model is it really helps to identify skill gaps in your current personnel and then help develop a personalized training program for each one of your employees. And one of the things when this first came out, I distributed to my buying staff and asked them to come back to me and identify where they thought they were weak and could use additional training. So I think it's a very useful tool in terms of helping develop a training program, both organizational wide, but also for individual personnel, so they can track and hopefully make continued progress in getting appropriate training. Also helps the model, in my mind, which has helped me personally in my organization to get additional funding for training, because you can use this model to show how what procurement does has changed so dramatically over the past 10 years. Like Patty said, we're not just buying pencils and paper clips anymore. You know, probably about 70% of what I buy is all services, IT, different types of professional services. So we certainly are doing a lot more negotiated agreements. And more importantly, we're the ones getting involved in going through those license agreements and other contracts that are provided by other suppliers, not only from the legal aspect, which we get assistance from law in terms of certain legal terms, but it's really our job to make sure that those scope of work and licensing agreements get what the end user wanted. And while law is great, our law departments are great in helping us with certain legal terms, indemnification and other things, they're really not that skilled either at terms of, is the scope of work appropriate? Is the scope of work going to satisfy what our end users requested for? So I think using this both ways to identify training, but also to help show the need to management during the budget process of why we need additional funding for training is a very good tool.
That's great. I think that'll be music to lots of people's ears, I'm sure. You know, everybody's always trying to figure out, right, how to get more budget and get more money for their people. So that's great. That's great. I'm glad to hear that. So maybe we can go ahead and jump right in. I know if there are any questions from anyone, please do submit them and we'll ask them right away. But let me just go ahead and you know, on purpose, these discussion points are quite short, but I think you've already started on a number of these through your discussion points. So we don't have to necessarily go in this order, but let me just start out. And you know, as I think others have seen, we'll make this a conversation among Patty, myself, and Paul. So Patty or Paul, if you have any questions for each other, please feel free to interject here. But I'll just start off by, you know, one question around, you know, the organizations that you have in terms of your workforce. You know, you mentioned you've got kind of relatively smaller size kind of workforce and you have to do a lot, right? And sometimes I think if you have a lot more people, you can potentially get more specialized. I'm just curious from your perspective in your organizations, do you see a difference in terms of, you know, the types of skills and things that your people may be required to have, you know, given that they might have to wear multiple hats and do lots of different things?
Yes, I do. You know, I have a relatively smaller organization, and my employees do have to wear, you know, many different hats, and a lot of them have to have a lot of these competencies that have been identified on this model. What's difficult, or maybe you know, one of the challenges is to you know, sit down with the individuals and get the buy-in. So that they understand, you know, these competencies and why the need is there, and to kind of step back from the process. It's very easy, at least I find it very easily for, you know, contract specialists and purchasing officers to get caught up in the process. And it's easy just to come in and do the process. But the process doesn't always guarantee a good result, a good end result. And that's what these competencies, in my mind, are about. They're identifying the skills needed, not only to do the processes that we have to do, because we're always going to have those processes there, but more importantly, that we get a good end result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Patty, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. You know, do you think, like, is it more difficult for your people to get specialized, or or do you find that, you know, people need to be more generalists, or can you still get them in your organization, get them to be specialized and focus on certain skills?
Well, even though we have more people, we have a lot of work in this office. And one of the challenges is trying to maintain that balance between productivity and quality. And, you know, we've had a lot of senior county staff concerned about throughput, how long it takes to do work. And one of my arguments is that anybody can do this fast, but if you want a quality contract, then that takes time. But setting that aside, because of the volume of work, our staff do need to be capable of pivoting from different types of contracts to another. We are aligned around our customers, so there's a team that supports public safety and IT, a team that supports facilities, construction, parks, recreation, and a team that supports health and human services. But even within those program areas, you still have a lot of very different customer requirements that they have to support.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can imagine that that's a lot, and that's why I think at least we've discerned that, you know, a challenge for, you know, where you have smaller staff and you have to be highly productive and you have to be able to do so many different things. So, unique challenge. Another question I had is more. Sorry, were you about to add something, Paul?
No, go ahead.
So, you know, let me just ask you about this again, about skill sets, and you know, you mentioned, Patty, early on about analytical skills and market research. Um, you know, so you know, we've done the survey about skill sets and where there are biggest gaps, and I think you mentioned a couple of them. Are there other ones there where you see the biggest gap and potential biggest bang for the buck, let's say, in terms of if you're advising, you know, others as they're looking at this model, and where, you know, how do they really drive massive improvement within their workforce and help their workforce? What advice do you have in terms of what skill areas, you know, do you think they should focus on based on your experience?
Well, looking at the competency model, you know, to add on to what I had already suggested, what we do every day here in the procurement office is solve problems, whether it's a phone call or it's a contract amendment or it's a brand new requirement coming in the door. We're solving problems. And what we're looking for is people who have good problem-solving skills. So that might not be necessarily reflected on a resume, but we try to tease that out through a combination of interview questions that look at skills and experience, but also behavioral-based questions. So that helps us get at some of the factors that are softer skills, but the tenacity that you need to be able to solve some of the complex problems that come through our door. So, you know, to add on to market research and analytical skills, it's also problem-solving skills, because that's at the heart of this business.
Great, great. No, that and we've heard that obviously a lot, and that's great. I think maybe you're able to share if you're able to share anything for others in terms of the kinds of questions you mentioned, how you test those skills. That would be interesting for others to hear as well. Paul, do you have a similar perspective here?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the competencies, some of the areas that I find with the biggest gaps or the need for improvement is market analysis, but really understanding what we're buying in the industry, not just taking out, a solicitation we've done 10 times and maybe tweaking a little bit and putting it back out, but do we really understand the industry? Do we understand how the industry prices things? Do we understand what is the best time of year to go out, depending upon the particular industry? Spend management is another area. We all have all this data sitting in our ERP systems, but do we really spend enough time looking at that data, analyzing it, learning from it? Specification development, I think is still a major area where there's gaps to, mainly due because the specifications that we're developing are becoming more complicated. So we're buying more complicated pieces of equipment, more complicated human services, and so forth. So the development of those specifications continues to get more difficult. And then two of the other areas, communication strategies, having everybody understand how important communication is within the procurement organization and out to our customers and suppliers, and driving change and innovation. And being accepting of change within the procurement function is something that really needs to be embraced. But we also need the skills to help roll out change to our end users within our organization. So those are some of the skills that I see where we certainly have gaps that we need to address.
That's great. No, and that might be a good segue. Your last kind of point that you mentioned about change and innovation. Maybe we could talk about that. Any change is difficult. We all know that, and especially I think change in behavior and kind of when we're talking about skills, et cetera. And Patty, you mentioned, or I forget, was it Paul or Patty? Just getting people to even accept, right, what skills, why different skills are needed, and then kind of going down that path of getting them to train, etc. So just curious, from a change standpoint, now let's say you've identified the gaps, and you've also now come up with a plan to really revise your position descriptions, your training, etc. What are the biggest change management issues you see in terms of advancing and getting your leadership as well as your workforce to accept the change?
Well, from my perspective, I think the biggest challenge is getting the workforce to accept the change. I think we're all pretty familiar that the demographics in public procurement certainly has a high number of people in the profession getting near retirement. And certainly most people, as they get near retirement, I think become less receptive to change, as opposed to if they were going to be here for another 10 or 15 years. So that's certainly, a challenge that I see, working with individuals that, only have a year or two left before they're going to retire, and getting them to embrace what we're trying to do here, in terms of change. So I think that's, one of the biggest challenges that I see. I think getting the support from management and administration, in my mind, is easier based upon the research that's been done.
Okay.
And I'll take another tact on that question, Raj. Paul did a good job of talking about internal change. The other aspect of it is organizational change. So, we often in our office or in our profession complain about having not having a seat at the table. So being able to demonstrate how we can positively affect county strategy through the procurement office is critically important, but we have to be involved in the front end of the decision making before we're left with no option to be able to affect change. So it's not only internal to the procurement office, but also at the executive function within your public body.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I think we can all probably relate to that. Um, yeah, also, you all mentioned, you both mentioned around training and budgets and everything. How big a challenge is that? So, in terms of from what we've heard, right, over time, that um, resources are always in short supply, budgets are hard to come by, getting more money. Could you talk a bit about that? Both of you mentioned that I think you have been able to at least get some more funds or get that justification through and get new positions. How did you go about doing that? And I ask more for others, my own knowledge, but others' knowledge as well. So they when they have a plan, they can really go out and try to get the resources they need.
Paul, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll just tell you, one of the things that I did, and it was a frustrating part, for a number of years, was that going back to having data can sometimes be be the feather in your cap. One of the things that most procurement organizations that I talk to, no one's real happy that if they get enough money for training, if they get money at all. Yeah. But yet we sit here and pay or arrange for training for many other departments in our jurisdiction. So I actually started to basically create a log and wrote a request based upon showing all the training dollars that were spent in all the other organizations within the county compared to what's been allocated to the procurement division. And as well, then, link that to the important work we do and a strategy and things of that nature. So, that's one tack that I took. I also have certain employees that are dedicated to certain departments, like public transportation, which are federally funded, and so we look to exercise whatever we can in that area. That when my employees are federally funded, we also include that we get training money from those departments as well to train those individuals.
That's a great idea, by the way, on the training piece. You all have access to that data, right?
Yep.
On training dollars, et cetera. So I love that. Patty, did you use a similar approach?
Well, my situation is different in that it starts at the beginning of the pipeline, and my difficulty in recruiting. So even though Fairfax County is in the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area, and you could fill a whole metro train or the whole system with people who have expertise and background in procurement, they don't come here. And there are a variety of reasons for that. It's not all exclusively compensation. But what we have come to realize over the years is we need to bring people in at the bottom of the career ladder and develop them. So that does mean that we have to have a budget for training and development and succession planning. So, through the annual budgeting process, I'm able to allocate dollars for training. And then because we are a large department, I can reallocate personnel funds from position vacancies and use that for training. So it's not a problem for us. I'm also very fortunate that we are part of the Virginia Association of Governmental Purchasing, VAGP, chapter of NIGP. They sponsor a lot of classes in the Northern Virginia area. So I have not only the funding, but the access. And so there's no boo-hoo here on that aspect of it. But
Yeah.
it's critical to my ability to be able to bring people in and develop them through that career ladder.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. I think it's helpful to talk about some of these things because I think, sometimes we talk about a lot of the grand, like higher level stuff, but some of the meat behind this of how do you actually get this done in your organization is just as or even more important, right? So that's great to hear how you're approaching that. Any other, we're running up against time now. Just curious, any other thoughts or, takeaways that you have that you'd like to share? Or maybe questions for each other?
Well, the only thing that I like to share is that, this was a good body of research that was funded by a nonprofit, was done in conjunction with a major university. And very rarely do we get that type of research to help us sell the value of procurement and what we do. I find most elected officials really have no clue of what we do. And this competency model is a very good summary of what we do and what we're involved with, on a regular basis. So, I would encourage everyone in public procurement to use this model for a variety of reasons within your organization, from, revising job specifications, for training plans to help you get training dollars. But it also just be used to really get a very good model of everything that procurement's involved with, to get others to understand exactly what we do.
Raj, I wholly support everything Paul said. I think that the first time I saw the competency model, it was embedded in that Volcker report, and that brings a lot of gravitas to the findings, and it does help you influence decision makers when you're trying to make accommodations and changes to workforce structure and class specs, and at the end of the day, competency, not competency, but compensation is essential key to all of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's honestly the work is a combination, I know, of a lot of people, right? Our team, but more so, you can't do this. I think like a lot of the evolution of this, and it was really formed by you all, right? By the leaders, and I think, going back to this one slide, I just want to point out, I think this philosophically, at least from a public spend forum and any of the work that I think we lead or facilitate, and we really believe that, any of this kind of work to put something valuable out there in the community that you can use, you have to have really a collaboration between all of these people, right? Among all these people, leaders that are in the trenches and can speak from many perspectives, other experts, academics, just lend credibility. I kind of find it amazing sometimes, even if they don't bring a whole lot of expertise, they just having an academic on your side helps in public sector, just to be candid. But yeah, it's great that I think through the hard work of all of these groups here, right, we've been able to use this, and I really appreciate all the kind of feedback that you put here in terms of the work in Fairfax County and then in Rockland County. So that's I'd encourage everyone, and we'd to reach out to Paul and Patty, and really to learn from them and see how they can also advance the work they are doing. And then just last thing, you can download this competency model on our website. So we'll pass that information on again. But please use that as a resource. And we spent a lot of time, and it's a free resource. We spent almost 4 years, and we just want to make sure it gets used by more and more organizations. So, but thank you, Paul and Patty, for your time today. And I'm sure people will be reaching out. But thank you so much, and appreciate all the great work everyone's doing within your organizations.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Great. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone. And we look forward to seeing you on another one of our webinars very soon. Thank you.